Greetings, everybody. I'm Larry Williams, the Director of CARMA, the Consortium for the Advancement of Research Methods and Analysis. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to another version of our CARMA Meet the Methodologist sessions. And this is where I take the opportunity to chat with CARMA webcast presenters about various types of career, professional, and personal issues. And it's my pleasure to be here today with Andreas Schwab. Andreas is Associate Professor and Dean's Fellow at the Ivy College of Business at Iowa State University. Among his recent methodological publications include articles in the Academy of Management, Learning, and Education on openness and research reporting, and in Org Science and other outlets sharing his work on null hypothesis HST, null hypothesis significance testing. Andreas is on editorial boards of Org Science and Organizational Research Methods, and is well known for the professional development workshop program that he runs with the Academy of Management on Bayesian analysis. So Andreas will be joining us in a couple of weeks on October 26th. And so Andreas, thanks for taking the time in your busy schedule to chat with us today.
My pleasure.
So let me begin by asking, how is it that you end up being a research faculty member in management with an interest in the types of methodological topics that you pursue?
Well, I have a business background, so I used to work for large airlines and did a lot of internal consulting for them. But I think I moved into the academic round partially because a lot of the projects we were doing at the time were highly interesting, but you were under so much time constraints with regard to finding a solution that I always felt like if I could dig a little deeper, we could find something even more interesting than the solutions that we were kind of finding. And I did that for several years, but that motivated me to consider the opportunity of doing a dissertation. And that then got me on a track to go to Wisconsin and started doing these larger research projects with a lot more independence on how deep I wanted to dig. And I got caught in that web. I never went back to Lufthansa and instead stayed academic and have been happily doing that for the last 15 years.
Yeah. So as you made that transition from Wisconsin to being a faculty member, as you look back on it, what do you remember about the process of learning research methods as a graduate student, and any parts of those experiences that really had a bigger impact on you than others?
So I think I learned a lot at Wisconsin. Sometimes I did not quite know what I had learned, or I didn't quite put it in the right perspective. But my transition, I thought before that actually I would leave a PhD program more completely trained than in hindsight I actually was. So for me, the transitioning was actually that during the first couple of years, doing research more independent on a larger scale with multiple projects, I learned a lot more. The PhD program positioned me to allowed me to understand, but I think a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about at the end of October are things that we started to kind of perceive, I started to understand, but I never completely comprehended it with its depth. And all this started afterwards, and it led me to be more interested or continue to be interested with regard to research methods. My initial plan was that I would have my research method toolbox ready, and then I would be out there just doing project. I study learning in organizational projects, entrepreneurial behavior in dynamic settings. And I thought I would do just that, executing. And instead I found myself more than 50% of the time actually trying to learn or advance with regard to research methods and try to inform others and hear from others what they have learned, how we can do things, I think, more advanced than we currently are doing.
Yeah, I spoke earlier today with Joe Hare, who will also be giving his webcast presentation on the same day as yours. And we were talking about this view that's common of nearly all doctoral students, that they're going to get their training that they need for their entire research career in their doctoral program, and they really don't realize just how much of a continuing education being involved as an academic is. So what were some of the other, as you made that?
Let me just follow up on that. I think
Yeah.
we're also in an interesting time right now, because I think we're seeing with the replication crisis in other fields and our fields, we're currently seeing a fundamental reconsidering with regard to what the methods are and how actually, we're not changing fundamentally the method. The toolbox stays relatively similar, but how we apply it, which part we apply, how we interpret it, I think that is really changing. And I foresee that personal experience is always, this is going to come during the next couple of years. But I think if you look back, probably 20 years or 15 years ago, people were saying the same thing. Just with regard to their computers, we can run regressions in completely different ways. It's a new world, a new dawn that's coming. So I think it's probably an experience that even other generations are having, and this is probably the normal situation, that we cannot stand still with regard to assuming that we have a fixed toolbox and then we're just going to have 10, 15 years of just executing it.
Yeah.
And it probably was never the case.
Yeah, no, that's great. I really appreciate you saying that. So let me follow up then. So, what are the types of changes that are going to be required of young scholars that are going to try to adapt to this world? It almost seems like it's not just learning new equations, but it's really a broader kind of almost philosophical or macro level change of view of how the rules of the game are changing that they're going to have to be responding to. Is that kind of what you're referring to?
Yes, I think it's kind of like the old adage that you have, you don't want to fight the last war. And a lot of the stuff that we get trained in PhD programs is, of course, based on what worked on the years before, what made the people that teach you successful. But at the same time, I think you're right with regard to we're approaching a time now where we're realizing that if 24 to 40% of our published research does not replicate, then we don't know what we really have accumulated. We have difficulty evaluating our evidence. And I think that and it's most people, I don't have the solutions on what exactly to do. And I think nobody really has. But for PhD students or who comes into the field right now, the biggest thing is being open to recognize these challenges and be willing to engage in a debate and discussions about what to do to address them. And my perspective is it will require going back to some of the fundamentals that we've been told by others for a long time, but we have just not implemented them. We have not made them part of how we interpret the data that we've collected.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'm really enjoying this, and I've got a couple of follow-up questions, but I think they'll plug in a little bit later. For now, I want to go back more to that transition to being a junior faculty member and what that was like for you and how that was different than what you thought it would be when you were a grad student.
I think from my perspective, I was very lucky with regard to the universities I went to, but the universities themselves were also changing. So I have a track record of having moved several times before I got here to Iowa State. And part of it was because I was doing, and I joined with regard to what I had in mind, but at the same time, the environments are changing. So one of the things that I perceived and learned is that I'm probably more married to a profession than I'm necessarily married to one specific institution. Mm-hmm. And we are a big field, and one of the advantages of things like CARMA and the internet is that we're much more connected in what we're trying to accomplish on the research side. and the universities are far less of a constraint with regard to the box with whom you should be talking to or whom else you should be talking to. And I found that very freeing. So it led to international collaborations. It has led in the end to me spending 2 Fulbrights in Indonesia. And I never anticipated that when I decided to become an academic and get a PhD in the US and took my first jobs here. And so of course I also was then to some degree not necessarily prepared for these opportunities. These opportunities were more emerging, and I think I took advantage of them as they were emerging.
Yeah, I think that's a real advantage and a real benefit for students becoming so involved in their professional association as early as possible in their career, because that's kind of the first step of broadening that identity. And if you're not there meeting and seeing and talking with these folks, it's much harder to develop that view.
Yeah, and the world is moving. So if we're in a situation where there are new ideas popping up and we need these discussions and debates, isolation is not helpful in that. And so CARMA is a great platform, but you're absolutely right. I'm also involved at the Academy of Management. I was a representative at large up to this year with regard to the Research Method Division. And the Research Method Division, as you know, has a lovely RMNet is a great resource with regard to hearing what's happening outside your own school and getting information from very knowledgeable people on specific issues. And similar, we've created a research method community at the Strategic Management Society. And that also serves the same purpose, to connect people with regard to input, debate, discussion platforms about methodological issues.
Yeah, so based on those experiences, as you became more integrated into the global community, and just what you learned from doing things on a day-to-day basis, do you have any sense as to how you have changed your approach, say, to research and writing and to teaching based on the experiences in your career up to this point?
It's always tough to judge yourself in hindsight.
Right.
And the other thing is that
well, that's the best way to judge it, because it always looks, you always
looks good, no?
You want to see out of the rearview mirror, and you can ignore everything else.
No, but we know from psychology how difficult to accurately judge yourself. Plus, a lot of the changes are often then happening very gradually, and you're not personally so, they're harder to detect how you actually move forward. I do think so. For me, a big step, even with regard to what we're going to talk at the end of October, was just one event at the Academy of Management in Hawaii, 2005, where I attended. There was a huge symposium that Bill Starbuck had organized with regard to the provocative title that all academy journals should be banning statistical significance testing. And I was like, that's all I know. Really, that's what I was doing fundamentally. And he wanted to ban it. So I thought I have to go. I have to visit and listen. And so that, I didn't understand everything that was discussed at that time, but it made me, again, curious enough to follow up, and even follow up with Bill Starbuck afterwards. And it led to him leading those workshops that you mentioned, that we have now conducted at the Academy for more than 10 years now. So on that side, that was something where I said it changed me, because it led me to start looking at methods again. I thought I was done after the PhD program. And then I started, for example, taking a course here at my university, which has a stats department, which is ranked in the top 10 in the US. And I took a Bayesian course here. But that was my choice. Not everybody, not every department head I had has agreed with that choice because it does slow you down on other sides. But at the same time, I found this the most rewarding thing because from my perspective, this was an area where I think I could contribute, and I saw real opportunities for making a change that would have impact on many other researchers as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So that it's probably the biggest. I did not anticipate myself to be as much involved in research methods as it turned out that I gradually moved into that direction.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, the more I talk with people like yourself and others of us that have gotten involved, it is often the case that there can be kind of some singular events where opportunities created themselves, and for whatever reason, we, you, I, and others kind of see that opportunity and respond to it in some way that ultimately shapes our career. So kind of related to that then, you know, it's an interesting thing if you talk to most students if you were to talk to most students after they come out of their doctoral program, and you say, well, what's really are the key things that you learn? Probably most of them would say something about statistics and testing theories and hypothesis testing. And they, as they say it, they really think that they know what they're talking about, right? But as it turns out, oftentimes they don't. So what is it about null hypothesis statistics, null hypothesis significance testing, and the use of statistics in general, the most graduate students miss, right? The real point is not just the math, but kind of the bigger picture that they should be developing.
Well, yes, I think you're right. Statistically, mathematical, there is nothing wrong with the statistical significance test. It does exactly what it's supposed to do. Mm-hmm. The problem seems more to be two-sided. One is we interpret it in directions and we overinterpret what it is telling us. That's one challenge, because then what we conclude may be more than what we can conclude from the probability that we just calculated. Mm-hmm. If you flip that around the other side, it also means there may be stuff in our data that we're not exploring at this stage, that is there, but we stopped the analysis after we completed the statistical significance test. Yeah. So, and then we have a tendency to overinterpret that test. It's that combination of things that seems to be the people have to warp their mind around. And then if we're overinterpreting based on a very limited test, my conclusion with regard to steps forward is there is other things we can ask from that data. There is other probabilities we can calculate. So the simplest, what we're going to talk on the 26th about as well, is we got to look at the effect size. It's really straightforward. And we've been told that for a long time. Why we institutionally don't do it to the degree is an open question, but it's water under the bridge, and I don't care about it. The big step is we got to move away from it. Yeah. If I talk to managers, I have a managerial background. So if I tell a manager I have this great research done, and I know it has a positive effect on your bottom line, they're going to immediately ask you, how big of an effect? And I can tell them, I don't know. But I know my test tells me it's positive, but I don't know how big it is. That disqualifies me as they're not going to base a decision on it. And the second question they're going to ask me is, how likely is it? What's the probability? What's the uncertainty of whatever effect you have? And again, with statistical significance tests, all I can tell you is the probability of observing this data under the assumption the null hypothesis of no effect is true. I cannot give you any probability about the probability of the effect to occur. Yeah. So it's very, very limited. And what I said earlier, our attempts are to interpret that probability based on the condition that the null hypothesis is true into some probability about the hypothesis or about the probability of the null hypothesis being true. But that's not, it's not telling us that. It cannot tell us that.
Yeah,
So
I find every time I teach the introductory stages of statistics, there's two things. So one is just explaining the null hypothesis test and the apparent inconsistency about building up a theory and reviewing research that argues for a relationship, and that we backdoor into that by first testing a hypothesis that there is no relationship. And then what's even, if you stop and think about it, doesn't make even less sense, is the fact that in all that theory and literature review, we explain for a directional relationship, but then we really adversely impact our ability to reach a conclusion by leaving open, by doing a two-tailed test. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
Harry, you're running into open doors with your argument.
I think they call that preaching to the choir, right?
And you're raising the point with regard to how did that become so institutionalized, and how did that become? We're studying organizations, and we know how these processes happen, and we're in the same situation. But again, moving forward after doing these workshops for 10 years, I think it's important to even more look into the future. Whatever we did yesterday is water under the bridge, and it's gone. It was probably all done with the best of intentions. But if we can see that we can do better, there is no reason why that should hold us back. So yeah. I agree with you. There is a lot of institutional institutional norms established that make it hard for people to even look beyond and recognize what statistical significance is not telling you. Because if you look at the journals, you see this is what everybody is doing, and they're not doing anything beyond that. So thereby you would assume this is the best practice. But if you want to move forward, you have to leave best practice behind and develop new best practice. And that's what we should primarily focus at. So
yeah, but the problem, right, and I'm interested in the degree to which you've experienced this, the problem is that at that point, the people who are the leaders, right, the editors, the leaders of our professional associations, they have all gotten to their positions via their success in a traditional way. So that really induces a lot of resistance that you have to encounter when you're trying to promote a newer view of thinking of things.
I'm completely with you, and there are, of course, other people have done studies on it. That this is not just something just we experience. Other fields experience exactly the same thing. These changes are difficult. Now, let me put on the devil's head. So I'm for the change because this is a change I believe in. But at the same time, of course, fields have to be to a certain degree conservative. We don't want to piggyback on every crazy idea that somebody has out there. But so it's the balance. We need to be conservative. We need to agree on things even when it's difficult. And once we have an agreement on it, it also should have some stability, not tomorrow we're going to do something completely different approach. But in this case, when the norms are so stabilized, the biggest benefit is probably moving forward with regard to getting away from it. And it is definitely hard. Otherwise, we wouldn't have done these workshops for 10 years. Mm-hmm. But you see, I think right now, my personal sense is that we're much closer to change that also could happen much, much faster. Because for me, a personal experience is if I was talking about the same topics 10 years ago, people didn't even know what you were talking about. Mm-hmm. Now, people have at least heard already and thought in the same direction. So there is a lot of undercurrent with regard to legitimacy that we need to do something different. We haven't figured out exactly what to do different, but we at least have that basis of we can't continue like this.
Yeah.
That for me makes me very, very optimistic.
Yep. The other thing, I hope that CARMA, can contribute to that broader cause, and I think. There are a lot of positive things in the sense of just think about the number of graduate students now who get exposed to the criticisms of null hypothesis significance testing. Probably it's increasingly common that a student will actually get a graduate course on Bayesian analysis, or they'll have articles in journals that they might be exposed to, like ORM.
Mm-hmm.
But still, it's of some positive feelings, but the institutional forces of resistance are pretty strong. So, you mentioned, so if we're talking really about two things, we've been talking about two things so far, reproducibility and the limits of hypothesis, our dominant hypothesis testing paradigm. Are there other issues related to our scholarly publishing process that trouble you today, either as an author or a reviewer? You hear a lot of people saying that there's a lot of parts to the system that are broken. So what do you
my friend, I think I struggle with the same thing most of us struggle. I want more of my papers published and quicker. So that's the process. So I'm in the same situation with the same frustrations that everybody has, but to some degree these frustrations are justified. I think primarily we have to recognize that evaluating innovative things, and we're trying to publish novel thoughts, extensions of theory, is in itself difficult to see on a first shot what is the value of it. We're much better 10 years, 20 years hindsight when we look back. But here we're asking reviewers to do these judgments in forecasting with regard to, is this going to be a contribution or not? So inherently, there's going to be a lot of noise, and people will have different heuristics on it, and they will not overlap. And we're a very heterogeneous field, which makes it even more, to some degree, unpredictable, because we have less common ground to stand on. Yeah. So I'm struggling with the same. I don't foresee any kind of fundamental big change on that. I think this is part of the inherent nature of the difficult evaluation we're trying to do. The world is changing, though. I think the world of publishing is changing. I think these online availabilities, there's a lot of things that we're currently not exploiting with regard to sharing information that is outside of the traditional paper publishing in the top journals. And I wish we would explore some of this more aggressively, because I think it would help us overall as a field. The main challenge I see is we have a very strong institutionalized incentive system and promotion system. Yeah. And it gets sometimes very, very narrow on this. And it's not, we're a big field. So what you said earlier, but all the editors, but there are editors who have some Bayesian background. They're very few, but we're a big field. So these pockets are existing. And I just wish some of these pockets would have more resources, or there would be more heterogeneity with pursuing some of these ideas outside of what is immediately publishable in the next 3 years in the top A-level journal. Yeah. So that we have portfolio. I need to publish there too. I think these journals serve important roles, but what is the portfolio that I can work with? And how much gets these portfolio into a monoculture of just being involved in 15 different projects, all targeted just on this one outcome?
Yeah, it's the way that I talk to a lot of people, probably underline the single most underlying concern with the development of lists and the identification of these elite journals is it leads to a devaluation of anything that's not in those outlets. And anybody who's been involved in it knows how much randomness there is between what gets in at an elite versus what gets in at one that's one step lower. I mean, when you have two reviewers and one out of maybe a top journal has 20 AEs, 15 to 20, I mean, it's just there's a lot of randomness to it. So, but we're trying to advance the cause, and so towards that end, we're very excited about having you come. Can you give us an overview of what you're going to be talking about? I remember as we talked about working towards a title, I was inclined to have it be focused only on Bayesian analysis.
Yes.
But I think your view at the time was that the solutions to the problems that we have need to be more broadly based than that. So anyhow, tell us what you're going to be talking about.
Yes. No, you're completely right. I am a big fan, or at least I'm promoting Bayesian ideas. But Bayesian is still a completely another methodology, and thereby it also requires a little bit deeper engagement. I think for us as a field, there are some much lower hanging fruits that we should pick up first before we go into the more complex areas. And that's why I think what I want to focus on at the end of October in our session. So one is, of course, we're going to briefly at least reaffirm what statistical significance is telling us and what it's not telling us, just to make that out, because if more people realize that, I think they immediately realize also the need for doing something beyond. And then the other part is what beyond. So we're going to talk a little bit about effect sizes. There's many different ways of how to do it, but also I like the ones that are very, very pragmatic, very simple. There's nothing wrong with simplicity. And so we're going to do some of that. And then the other thing that I'm recently getting more and more convinced of is that beyond effect size, we need to talk about uncertainty related to the effect. And again, we can do that. Bayesian does that with a posterior distribution, but we can do that also in much more pragmatic and primitive ways. So I'm very convinced just even mapping out, creating graphs of effect distributions, predicted effects in our data is a huge step forward with regard to getting an understanding what the data is trying to tell us. If we have a bimodal distribution of effects, even the effect size, the average, I would interpret very differently. It might lead other researchers to much more sophisticated hypotheses if they would know a little bit more about the patterns in our data. So it's these approaches with regard to effect size investigations. What can we do with graphing this out? What do we use as a benchmark? What does make this interesting? Assuming no effect whatsoever is oftentimes a straw man that is easily burned. Because if I do a reasonable intervention, any normal person would assume that there will be some change. But we got to find maybe better. Are we better than a random effect? Are we better than a momentum that is occurring? So these are the things that we currently with statistical significance testing have not been discussing, have not been focusing at, but we need to focus on to get a better tool set with regard to exploiting all the data that we're collecting. And that takes money and time, where there is so much more information that we can learn from. And currently, we have the tools, but we're just not applying them.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I'll be very much looking forward to speaking to you in person and welcoming you to Lincoln, Nebraska for your October 26th webcast. We're grateful that you can find the time in your busy schedule to do that, and also for taking the time to chat today. It's been a real treat. I will look forward to hanging with you in a few weeks then. Thank you, Andreas Schwab.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks.